Dear guests, dear colleagues, welcome to this seminar, the Transnational Lists and Spitzenkandidaten Principle, Concrete Solutions for Enhancing the European Public Sphere. This seminar is organized by the group of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament. And I am Domènec Ruiz-de-Besa, the group's coordinator for constitutional affairs, and on behalf of my group, I am delighted to Sorry, I was saying I'm delighted to welcome you, and I am grateful to our guests for having accepted the invitation to this webinar. Leinen, Professor Michael Kedin, and Petros Fasoulas. I think this is a very, I will say, timely event, and on a very important topic. This is not a capricious topic. It's not, we're not talking about this just as an academic exercise, but in the context of the reform of the electoral law, of which I am the rapporteur. I will say more on this later on. And because we need to strengthen this European public sphere, and there are at least three things that can be tackled with pan-European electoral constituency. First, to strengthen the role of European political parties that will be in charge of designing, drafting, and tabling the transnational list. Second, the generation of a pan-European debate at the time of the European elections, so we don't have 27 national elections, but a real European election talking about transnational topics of interest to European citizens. And third, the third possible potential benefit will be to strengthen the principle of Spitzenkandidaten, because by having the candidates to the presidency of the European Commission heading the respective transnational lists, it will be clear to the voter, unlike in the past, that they will be expressing one vote for the election of members to the European Parliament, but also a vote indicating a preference for a potential president of the Commission. Of course, indicating a preference in the sense that it is the competency of the European Parliament to provide a majority for that president of the Commission. But before getting into the details with the experts and with other participants, I'd like to show a short video message from Irache García Pérez, the president of the Socialists and Democrats, for welcoming remarks.
Confirma el interés de la ciudadanía en la Unión Europea. Además, en las últimas elecciones europeas, la participación aumentó un 10%, lo que confirma el interés de la ciudadanía en la Unión Europea. Además, los resultados mostraron un apoyo mayoritario a las fuerzas proeuropeas, entre las
The turnout showed a majority support for pro-European forces, to which the S&D group belong. The Union has so far always taken a stride forward with every crisis. This pandemic should be no different. For us, it should be an opportunity to return to the essential, to restore the spirit of solidarity. If COVID-19 has shown us anything, it is that we are a community that depend on each other on all levels, from grocery shopping for isolated or ill neighbours to the leverage that we have if we act as one on the global markets when buying medical supplies. We must act as what we say we are, a community that cares for people. In this spirit, we will take part and look forward to the conference on the future of Europe. The European Union is the most extraordinary political innovation in history. It has delivered decades of peace and prosperity in Europe and has shown humankind that sovereign nation-states can form a union to jointly manage transnational issues in an interdependent and globalized world. Much has been achieved, but a long road still lies ahead in order to fulfill the vision of an ever closer union and a true European public sphere. This is an opportunity to give this impetus. We've seen complex and slow progress. The S&D group regretted how the role of the European Parliament in the choice of Commission President in what was known as the Spitzenkandidaten process was undermined after the last elections. This process should have been a step towards a more transparent and more democratic European Union. Although our group fought till the last minute, this was a missed opportunity to consolidate this practice. Now we need to look forward, however. Improving the decision-making and the democratic legitimacy are fundamental tools in the goal of building a stronger political union. We will listen to citizens' inputs in the next couple of years. At the same time, and under the subject of today's webinar, some improvements in the quality of the EU's democratic functioning can also be made through our parliamentary and legislative daily work. Here, the framework of the Lisbon Treaty should be explored to the maximum. A true exercise in democracy demands openness to institutional change. This is not just a bureaucratic issue, but a necessary tool to achieve our policy priorities. The setup of the Union has an impact on its capacity, and we've often seen firsthand during the pandemic that the current powers of the EU are lacking or inadequate to respond to the challenges before it. Our group calls for a reform that strengthens the quality and quantity of European democracy. We ought to use all the ways inside the existing treaties to improve the decision-making of the Union, such as applying qualified majority voting in all policies and enhancing the Parliament's role, particularly on its right of legislative initiative. In this respect, looking at the institutional side of the needed reforms, this legislature will be given two essential tasks for the future of EU democratic representation. Firstly, consolidating the Spitzenkandidaten process, and secondly, exploring an electoral reform that sets up a pan-European constituency in the Union, electing part of the Parliament's members while taking into account the need to ensure geographical balance, particularly as regards the smaller member states. This could enhance the European dimension of EU elections and strengthen the democratic life of the Union. Thank you all. I wish you a fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much, Irache, for this very, I will say, substantive message, very concrete in terms of the importance of the institutional dimension, so often overlooked. And let me also, and I think the group president has set the right tone for the discussion. I will say a tone of ambition, but also with a reminder, I would say, of the careful design, particularly as it regards the question, I will say, of geographical balance that we have to address. But let me also apologize for the technical difficulties that we have experienced at the launch of the event. I think they are solved now. And let me add a few words after our president in order to highlight the political framework of the event. As rapporteur in the Constitutional Affairs Committee for the reform of the European Electoral Act, I am about to present to table my legislative proposal after several rounds of consultations with the shadows of other political groups and with a range of different stakeholders. The political goal of the report is to shape in a concrete way a European public sphere by suggesting tools and legislative changes ahead of the next EU elections. The intention of this webinar is first of all to show that we need to combine and address three main priorities in the goal of strengthening the European public space to which I referred earlier. Shaping more clear rules for the head of the list or a Spitzenkandidaten principle as an electoral mechanism linked to the creation of a joint constituency. That is achievable, and Irache made a good reference to that, only if the concerns of the small and medium-sized member states are addressed. And this is at the core, and this will be at the core of my proposal to achieve strict, and I will emphasize the adjective strict, geographical balance within the list. I believe that we have to find indeed this balance between the three elements that I mentioned before, and it is my intention to find a consensual solution and the right combination between the different principles that are strictly linked and needed if we want to obtain also the support of the Council once we adopt the Parliament text. Of course, we are all aware that this is a difficult challenge to start within the Parliament. I will say the approach of the European People's Party group at the European Parliament has shifted from the position they took in the last parliamentary term. But I like, and I think this should be the purpose of this seminar, I like to be able to carry the entire group, our entire political family, the entire Socialist and Democrat group, along with a good proposal. And this means, of course, providing what I hope is a convincing solution for colleagues coming from smaller delegations. And we'll have time to discuss this later on. Procedurally, it's important to remind that the EP has the right of initiative on this file, and as we know, this feature is now becoming one of the milestones of the new narrative about the future of Europe. As in other files where the European Parliament enjoys a right of initiative, in this case from Article 223 of the treaty, we should be smart enough to play our role with ambitious and pragmatic proposals, meaning the two. I think we have to be ambitious in the vision that we're trying to achieve. These three goals that I mentioned at the beginning: strengthening the European political parties, strengthening the pan-European dimension of the European elections, and strengthening the principle of head of the list, Spitzenkandidaten. But we have to be also pragmatic on how we deliver that vision. And as I said, we have to be prepared to, I think, emphasize the question, among other things, of the geographical balance within a transnational list. We are aware, and this will provide, I think, if we do that, we can provide the right political momentum. We are aware of the previous Parliament's proposals for the reform of the electoral law, and especially in this phase, as a source of inspiration, it is important to assess in detail the differences between the Council's agreed text and the European Parliament's initial position in the past, and to consider the main difficulties that we had at the time in the talks with the Council. The contributions of our guests will be very important, I believe, in this respect. Before we start the interaction with our invited guest, I'm delighted to introduce another video message that we received from Vice President of the European Commission, our friend Vera Jourova, who is, as a commissioner, precisely in charge. She has been tasked, she was tasked by the President of the Commission of supporting technical work and political initiative regarding precisely the question of Spitzenkandidaten and Transnational Lists. So over to you, Vice President.
Honorable members, distinguished guests, thank you for inviting me to your webinar. I am glad to see that you continue to discuss important political and strategic questions of principle, such as the selection of the members of the European Parliament and the Commission President. This Commission remains open to play our role as honest broker in this context, without wishing to preempt the approach to be taken by the appropriate actors, you, the European Parliament, and the Member States. We would, for instance, stand ready to provide legal and institutional expertise on electoral processes and insight into interinstitutional relations if the Parliament and the Council deem it useful. I also welcome that from the side of the European Parliament and from your group, there is also continuing interest for the institutional and electoral issues to be discussed as part of the democracy debate in the context of the Conference on the Future of Europe. Should the issue of the lead candidate system and transnational lists come up in these debates, I am ready to join. And I am glad to see the same interest in the European Parliament, in particular from Mr. Ruiz de Veza and his work on EU electoral issues. Allow me to wish you a fruitful webinar, which will for sure provide further input in the debates.
Thank you very much to Vice President Jourova. We appreciate her words, since of course in our effort of drafting this new proposal for an electoral law, it will be crucial to rely on the support of the European Commission. Of course, as you might know, the Parliament, as I already said before, as a matter of fact, enjoys a special right to initiate this legislative proposal, but of course, the Commission can play a very important role, not only for its technical expertise, but also for its role as facilitator of the dialogue, the one that we will have later on between the European Parliament and the Council. Now, let's move on to our panel. I'm delighted to welcome our comrade and good friend, Leinen, former Socialist and Democrat member between 1999 and 2019, so long career and a lot of experience in the European Parliament. Joe was not only S&D coordinator in the Constitutional Affairs Committee until very recently, but most of all, he was the last Parliament co-rapporteur on behalf of our group on the previous attempt to reform the European electoral law. The Leinen-Hübner report, as approved by the European Parliament in 2015, still constitutes a fundamental reference for our work today, and we will carry on all of the innovations that that draft incorporated in our proposal plus other things, and will be considered as the starting, and as a matter of fact is the starting point for the new proposal that we are finalizing in the drafting these days. So please, Joe, thank you very much for being here with us. It's a pleasure to see you again, even if through the screen. The floor is yours. For 10 minutes.
Mr. Leinen, please click on the speak button.
Ja, lieber Dominik, liebe Freundinnen und Freunde.
Dear Dominic, dear friends, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to this seminar. I'm very pleased to be here because in the 20 years in which I was a member of the S&D group, the subject of the Europe of citizens and of European democracy were always priority subjects, not just for myself, but for many of our members, because Social Democrats and Socialists have democracy running in their veins. It was our party who, over the last century, has fought for democracy and has done such a lot to ensure that we have democracy at the national level in almost all European countries, and that's a great success of the progressive forces. Because Social Democrats and Socialists have understood that without democracy, many other things aren't possible. Social progress, social rights, basic rights. These things don't work in autocratic or dictatorial setups. So democracy is a fundamental treasure for progress and for people. And so that's why I think it's our mission. Seeing as what we've managed to do at the national level, it's now something that we have to do at the European and transnational level. And we can start with the European Union. That's what we have in Europe. But if we look towards the future and look at democracy at the global level, one day, if that's what we want to have one day, I mean, if we look at how the way the world is set up now, it's very unfair and very undemocratic in many places. In the EU, we have better relationships. We have a European Parliament. But I have to say that the promise that was made more than 40 years ago with the introduction of the first direct vote, that promise hasn't been fulfilled. In the Electoral Act of 1976, it was stated that together we have joint European rules for the implementation or for the carrying out of European elections. And 40 years later, elections continue to work following 27 national rules and not following European rules. So it's an unfulfilled promise. And that needs to be resolved. And I recently said there's some good research that's been done by the University of Oxford where they looked at what citizens think of the idea of having national elections, but for the European countries. And lots of people said, well, we're not interested in the European elections because they say the parties discuss national subjects. They argue over national subjects, national issues, and that's not a European election. And I think that's a point, a reason why very often European elections have been considered to be second-class elections. If we want them to be first-class elections, we'll only do that, we'll only achieve that if we see that we've got 27 countries and 450 million citizens doing things together and making progress together. Now, I think it's clear that we once again have to take this opportunity to bring in the missing parts of the mosaic and to implement what we want in Europe. We need to strengthen the parliament with giving them the right of initiative, and co-decision needs to be the standard method for making legislation. And I would say investigation rights for the parliament. If you think about the LuxLeaks, the Panama Papers, etc., all of these scandals that haven't really been followed up on, and where the parliament, as the chamber of the citizens, really has an important function to play. So these are elements of a full-scale parliament, and it would be a way of strengthening the European Parliament. But what we are missing is the ongoing political debates at the European level, transnational deliberations. They are very difficult, very painful, and that's broken down the political arena across Europe. We've seen in some countries very different debates from those that are carried out in other countries, even though we have the same problems and shared problems. And there's no way of having a mishmash of this. We can only create a European space if we have the democratic infrastructure to shape this democratic space. The existence of European parties is a very important pillar. I was pleased that I was a rapporteur twice and that we were able to set up a European statute for European parties. But I would also like to say that the parties themselves have an awful lot to do. I regret the fact that we can't become directly a member of a European party, but only can become a member of the European Party indirectly through a national sister party. And I think that the contributions that we give, the financial contributions that we pay to our national parties, should be split, one part for the National Party and one part for the European Party. And then it would be visible as well. We'd be able to see we belong together. Perhaps now, with the experience of the Conference of the Future of Europe, I could imagine as well that we would have multilingual platforms to be able to discuss current political subjects, but particularly election programs, and to work on those electoral programs. So these are things that are within the scope of things that the European Parliament has to do and needs to do. Then we've also got the regulation of parties, so we need to have another look at that. We need to create better instruments to strengthen European parties. The Spitzenkandidat process, I think that's something that we could really deploy. We don't need a law for that, a European law or an act. The parties can do that. What we saw in 2019 was that the principle wasn't taken seriously. And I think that's something that we need to work on. The Spitzenkandidat method needs to be really anchored in what we do. It has to be followed because that's a part of democracy. We have the heads, we have the executive, the leaders of the government. They should be known before an electoral campaign and not once an election has taken place and be decided upon behind closed doors. There needs to be transparency. There needs to be respect for citizens. They need to know who the leading figures of a future government are, and they need to know that during the electoral campaign. These future leaders need to say who they are and what they want during the electoral campaign. And for the European elections, that has to be followed. We must not lose the Spitzenkandidat model. We've got that. It's a system that's anchored within our system. And I think that we need to improve this mechanism on the eve of the election and the days following an election. We could imagine, for example, that the Council on a Tuesday has its summit and then the next day the parliament only then knows who's been chosen. We can't do things from one day to the next. We need to have consultations between the council and the parliament, and between the leaders of the parties and the groups in parliament, and all of that needs to be improved. We need to do something before the election as well. I think that in 2019 we went into the election and the EPP, well, they thought, well, if we have a greater mandate than the others, we'll automatically get the Commission's president role, even though we've always said it depends on the majority of members in the parliament. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a greater mandate than the other groups. It's not logical. If the EPP is always the head of the European Commission, that just can't be done like that. So you need the majority of the MEPs in the newly elected parliament. And before the election, perhaps we need to decide on coalitions, be that formally or informally. That was something that was lacking in 2019. And so in the end, we went into the 2019 elections in the dark, really, and then there was this huge accident where none of the Spitzenkandidaten became the president of the Commission, but Videos ex machina, well, randomly from Macron and Merkel decided on von der Leyen, and that really weakened the system, and we can't have that happen a second time. Now, we have our European parties, we have our Spitzenkandidaten, and what we're missing from this triangle is the European lists. Because of the Spitzenkandidaten, they need a list where these people can set up their candidacy, and it's not very, you can't just have the candidates known in their country. It doesn't create much credibility. And I understand the fears from smaller member states. I know that we can resolve the issues. We could find ways to share the mandates. We know that there's been a mistake made with the Duff report. We shouldn't have had just 25 mandates on the European list. We had 28 countries at the time and only 25 mandates. That wasn't correct. And the parliament elections in the 90s were actually more progressive in that sense. 1995, we saw that the parliament had 10% of the mandate for the European list. That was what they requested. And that would have been 70 mandates. And so I think that there, both gender equality and geographical equality is something that could be covered through that. That could be organised. I think that we should also perhaps find models to figure out how that can work. You'll be able to read quite soon a text on the project of the European democracy. And I am finishing up here.
I'm working with FEPS, and there is another model called double proportionality. I only mentioned it in this seminar. There is a model where you could distribute all the 705 mandates in the parliament via a European method of distribution. So all the votes would be counted of a political family on the European level, and in a proportionality way would be redistributed on a national level. I didn't mention it, Dominic, in the AFCO seminar because I wouldn't like to confuse all federalists who want the plan A, which is the European lists. But there is possible as well a plan B, where political families fight together and the votes are counted together to redistribute the mandates. I only tell it in this seminar to have it on board if we need it one day. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, dear Joe, for your very concrete points. I think that you're very right on your remarks regarding what happened with the Spitzenkandidaten, the principle of head of the list in 2019, because had that accident did not happen, we will have had the principle operational in 2 consecutive elections, 2014 and 2019. And in Europe, as in life, when something happens twice, then is there for the rest. But we have now to come up with something, I think, powerful to ensure that in 2024, what happened 2 years ago doesn't happen again. And I think a well, carefully designed, as you say, with a good model, pan-European constituency can provide, the answer. And I agree also with you, Joe, when you say that in the ideal, and this is something that I think it can be done without changing the treaty, the President of the European Council, after the election, as it happens in a national democracy with the head of state, should do a round of consultations with the leaders of the European political parties and parliamentary groups, precisely to assess which candidate of those that have run in the election has a chance to form a majority. Because it's a point also that we cannot overemphasize. This is not a presidential election. This is not a system in which the one that has won in the transnational constituency becomes automatically the candidate for president of the Commission. This could be so, provided that there is a majority in Parliament. If not, other options, the second one, if he has more support in Parliament, can also be the one proposed by the European Council for the job of President of the Commission. So the role of Parliament is always there as it is now. We're just, in my view, of course, we're just giving the voter the opportunity to express a clear preference, Very well. So let's move on now. I'm honored to give the floor now to Professor Michael Keating, Professor of European Integration and European Union Politics at the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany. Professor, thank you very much for having accepted our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, honourable members of the European Parliament, honourable Chairman, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I'm very happy to be here with you, and I will be given 10 minutes now to elaborate on a couple of ideas which I prepared for you to bring in maybe some additional food for thought for your discussion. Just to be very clear from the very early beginning, I very much like the ideas, the prioritization at the end, your 3 priorities. And what I would like to say also from the very early beginning, I also like very much the ideas you propose in the draft resolution with regard to gender, with postal voting, with the Common European Voting Day, with candidates' age, harmonization here, etc. But I'm here to basically also give you maybe one additional food for thought, and that is to bring in the idea of equal opportunities and capacities, and if you want, to bring in a social component. Could we advance with our slides? One more, please. Yes, so I prepared a few slides, 3 in total, which I will show to you. And to make my point, which I made at the very early beginning, very clear, let's have a quick look at this. I'm an academic, so I look around the literature. And what I see in the literature is that the concept of political equality is divided between equal rights, and that means formal access to voting, between equal voice, and that would refer to one man, one woman, one vote principle. And that is perfectly well covered by the draft resolution so far, by addressing the issue of gender, by addressing the issue of postal voting, by addressing the issue of Common EU Voting Day and the candidate's age. But what I think could maybe be further strengthened is the last component. and that is the one of equal capacity and opportunities. Because in the end, we are having this webinar here today because we want to talk about transnational lists and lead candidate processes. So we intend to increase the legitimizing power of European elections. And in order to increase the legitimizing power of European elections, we have to pay attention as well as to equal rights and equal voice, but, and maybe a little bit more, also, in my opinion, very strong social component of political equality, the aspect of equal capacities and opportunities. Could we move on with the next slide? On this slide, I will now elaborate my argument. Very quick, very down to earth, nothing dramatic. We have heard the president of the S&D group celebrating the European elections. We can maybe have in the Q&A session a short reflection on this as well. But what you see here for the European Parliament 2019 elections is the social component of European elections. What we see is, for example, in Amsterdam, I selected a couple of European capitals here. And you see that in Amsterdam, in the European elections, there were 103 voting districts. In the voting district with the highest voter turnout for the European Parliament elections, we had a participation of 83.5%. But there was also a voting district with only, and that was the lowest number, of 19.9. So we have in the very same city, Amsterdam, a cleavage, a discrepancy between the strongest, in terms of voter turnout, electoral district and the lowest electoral district in terms of voter turnout of more than 60% in the very same city. And this is something we also see and find in Madrid. They don't have as many voting districts, 21, but there is also, despite the staggering increase during the European elections 2019, we see within the city, so the moment we leave the aggregate level, the country level, and zoom into the city level, we see a social component. Because as I will show you in a second slide, not yet, sorry, you will see that this voter turnout correlates very highly, as you already know from experienced electoral campaigners, very highly with the socio-economic characteristics of a district. But what I want to achieve here for the time being is that we all understand that it's one thing to look at the aggregate level, at the member state level, in order to say something about voter turnout. And again, we are here to increase the legitimizing power of European Parliament elections. So my offer is to zoom further into the city level. Because once you start zooming, also in Bratislava, you will see a difference of roughly 20%. Tallinn, more than 20%. Prague, 25% almost. Paris, 18%, Berlin almost 20% as well, and Vienna 24%. Now, this discrepancy, I think, is very important to understand first, to then, and then I would kindly ask you to go to the next slide, to understand that in these city districts, so you see now for the various cities, Amsterdam, Berlin, Bratislava, Madrid, Paris, Prague, Tallinn, and Vienna, the electoral districts I counted are now dots here in these graphs. And what you will see is on the x-axis, this one here is the unemployment rate, and on the y-axis, the voter turnout. And what you see happening for all cities is one clear trend, and the trend we all know, right? We go from the top left down to the bottom right. There is a very strong relationship between voter turnout and socio-economic characteristics, such as unemployment rates. So the higher the unemployment rates in the voters' district, the lower the voter turnout. And this is something, as you can see here, holds for European elections as well as, and here's the link now with the Council, because we want to talk probably also with on the Council later on, also holds this relationship for national and local elections. So there is nothing really particular about this phenomena, but we tend to forget or not to emphasize, or at least to emphasize more on the equal rights and the equal voices arguments, and disregard a little bit the aspect of equal opportunities and capacities. Next slide, please. And this basically brings me also to the end of my presentation, because what I want you to basically chip into this discussion here is that, first of all, we might want to consider to bring in a stronger social component into the draft resolution by emphasizing the aspect of equal opportunities and equal capacities. That we understand that while the level of turnout plays only a minor role actually for equal right issues and equal voices issues, so whether we now have actually postal voting and gender-related issues or the candidate age aspect harmonized, is something that does have an impact on the voter turnout. But what has a much stronger voter turnout is the third element, the equal opportunities and capacities argument. And this is where we all start understanding that social inequality in voter turnout threatens the ideal of political equality. And this is, I think, the link that political equality is closely linked to social equality is something that might be further strengthened in our discussions, because I think the discussions are very clear. The report as it looks very, very promising, because in the end I would come up with the same conclusions as you do. I would come up with the conclusion that in order to actually address the aspect of social equality is to strengthen European political foundations and European political parties, because it is them having the link like a spider web, so to say, with all the 27 member states, and talking about also the additional social component, which I was elaborating here. And secondly, the prioritization of pan-European debates, of course, is also an aspect that would very much endorse the idea, because elections only can evolve and have a legitimizing power the moment we also start spreading the word and think around the socio-economic aspect, factors weakening potentially the integrative and the legitimizing power of elections. And this is where pan-European debates, this is where European political foundations, European political parties can do a lot by spreading the word, organizing seminars, making sure that we do not only know about the social discrepancy for the classical, let's say, usual suspects of countries in the European Union, but that we know and have this solid understanding of social discrepancy, of voter turnout, the third element next to equal rights and equal voices, to strengthen that aspect, to talk about, to brief people who are responsible at the national levels for electoral campaigns about the relevance. Bringing me to the last point, that these joint constituencies in this regard could perfectly operate as a test case for doing exactly this, for taking into consideration everything you developed already related to equal rights and equal voices, but also to emphasize more stronger as a social democratic party group the social component of the social component of political equality for the European elections. And I hope with this I gave you some food, some appetite for more. I'm more than happy to address questions either during today's afternoon Q&A session or then also after this webinar. Thank you very much for your attention. You would not need to show all the slides. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Michael, for this I don't know if I should call it thought-provoking, in the sense that those figures of the differential in the voting in the same cities between the richest and the poorest neighborhoods, it's very telling. And I agree with you that if I think I agree with you that it's reasonable to expect, and at least we have the opportunity to test it, that in addition to the three aims of the proposal, if we can also, as a result of the higher visibility of European political parties, as you mentioned, as a result of a more visible pan-European debate, and in the end, you know that politics is like a drama, it requires actors, and we need the, I don't know to call them the prima donnas or the main characters of the show, the tops, the Spitzenkandidaten, no? The tops of the list, that can also move across Europe and also reach the areas that are not, as you showed, not participating as actively as others. We may also increase the turnout in the election. That will be interesting. The turnout in the national constituencies, as we have them now, that will be also a very good thing. So thank you very much, Michael. So now, to conclude the round of interventions, I give the floor, and we are doing on time, apart from the delay we experienced at the beginning. By the way, I forgot to mention that this seminar is being broadcasted live in the website of the S&D group, and we have interpretation available in German, English, Spanish, French, Italian, and Romanian. So now I give the floor to our good friend, the Secretary General of the European Movement, Petros Fasoulas. European Movement International, has been very active in initiatives to strengthen European public space, also at the time of European elections. And also, I think you have done important work on the question of the pan-European electoral constituency. So it's important. We had Joe representing, in a way, our own political family. Then we had Michael as an academic, and now the voice of the organized civil society, and the oldest, alongside the Union of European Federalists, the oldest pro-European civil society group in Europe. So Petros, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dominic, both you for the invitation, but also the S&D group in AFCO for this very important initiative, because what we're discussing today are at the heart of efforts to make our union more democratic and engage our citizens even more deeply in the decisions that affect them. Like you said, we know each other for a while. Your work, both for the European movement, for the Federalists, but also in the European Parliament, is remarkably important. And the pleasure is double for me because Joe is also on this panel. Joe has been the president of the European Movement International for 6 years. He was there when I first was recruited, so it's really good to see him too. And I should say that he has been a guiding light in this debate for the European movement in particular, but also for all pro-Europeans in general, not just in the S&D, but beyond. Now, in the 10 minutes I have, I want to raise a couple of issues. Both Joe and Professor Keating really did a great job in mapping out some of the key questions that we have to deal with and providing answers for some of them. The one thing I would like to stress is that we have a serious problem that we cannot hide from. Unfortunately, the European elections are not as European as they should be and as they could be. And that is a real challenge, I think, that we are all facing, both those of us in civil society, but also those of you in academia and in active politics. Because unless we truly Europeanize European elections, we won't be able to make our democracy also pan-European and transnational. Electoral reform plays a huge part, and the efforts that the European Parliament especially has been undertaking in that regard in the past few years are significant. But I think electoral reform in itself isn't enough. I will come back to some of the things that we could do, but I think it is important to also remind ourselves some of the other challenges that we need to address if we are really to make our elections more European. For example, we lack a European polity in the way that we do at the national and regional and local level. We need to really build that European polity if we are to make our elections much more European. We also lack a European public sphere, a European public debate. Like Joe and Professor Keating said, but also you, Dominic, a lot of the time the discussion takes place in a national, even at a local context, and not so much at a European context. So the research that Joe mentioned is telling. People feel that why should they engage with these European elections if they're not about European issues? So we need to also work hard in building that European public sphere. And again, the work that the European Parliament is doing in that regard is very important, and hopefully us from the civil society side, especially those that are present throughout Europe, like the European movement, we try to also contribute in that regard. The other problem I think I identify with regards to the European nature of the European elections is the lack of a European press. Again, something I think members of the European Parliament often confront, that we don't really have a lot of truly European outlets. There are a couple of exemptions, but you can count them in the fingers of one hand. And that reduces the opportunity for exposure of European politics to a wider audience. The role that media plays, local, regional and national media, in a national political debate is hugely important. And the fact that we don't have such European outlets, true European outlets, is indeed a compromising factor that we also need to look at if we are going to achieve a more European election. And of course, there is another element, is the lack of a common language. It's a challenge, of course, that is inherent in a multinational, multilingual construction like the European Union. It's one that we cannot avoid. It's one that we indeed embrace, but we have to admit that it does make the functioning of European democracy a bit more complicated than it is when we're talking about national politics. So again, in this instance, technology and other innovations can certainly go a long way in addressing that problem, but it's one that we also need to confront when we're thinking about how to Europeanize European elections. Now, on the particular questions of European electoral reform, and a lot of effort has been done there, and there are some really good ideas on the table, and I'm glad to see that people like yourself, Dominic, and others are taking the lead. Not just because of your role within the S&D family, but I think also because of your ability to build alliances and bridges across the floor and the political spectrum. Because as it was mentioned before, it's really important to have consensus on these issues if we're going to be successful in reforming electoral law at the European level. And in that regard, the European movement is happy to contribute. As you know, we're a cross-party organization that we include the 4 main pro-European political families, and I think it's important to find those fora where we can have dialogue across the political spectrum so we can find consensus and move forward together. There are indeed some concrete things, and I think we are also in a very opportune moment. We are about to start the Conference on the Future of Europe, finally, and there, there are ample chances to discuss some of the main issues. And in our recent position on the conference, the European movement, have identified electoral reform as one of the priority areas where work should be done and ambitious proposals should be put forward. And just like you, we have of course identified that Transnational List and the Spitzenkandidaten process are 2 elements that can really contribute significantly in Europeanizing European elections. But these are not the only things. Perhaps they are the headline issues, as you very correctly pointed out, but they're not the only things we can do. I think it's important to look at the creation of a European constituency. Again, there is a lot of discussion, a lot of literature, a lot of debate around this issue, but it can go a long way in creating that sense of European elections. Then we need to create true European political parties. the more we invest in the Europeanization of political parties, the more our elections will be also European. So, we need to give more autonomy to European parties. We need to ensure that they have a common manifesto across the European Union, and we need to ensure that those political propositions are communicated in a similar way in all the different countries, using different languages. But it's important for people to understand who they're voting for and why. Then we need to see how the membership of those European parties can also be expanded to enable citizens to join not just the local or national branch of a party, but also the European level of a party. That will make them much more engaged in this European exercise that we call the European elections. And by membership, I also mean the ability to shape and influence the manifesto of that European political party and the direction it plans to go, even selecting its candidates for the Transnational List or even the Spitzenkandidaten. I think the more avenues we give to citizens to engage with European politics, individually or through a political party, the better it will be. Now, I mentioned earlier the need for a common manifesto, and I think that's something we have encountered. Often people are unclear about what the program is for European elections, who exactly decides and what are the propositions of each political party. I think it's, again, very important to make that a bit more visible, to ensure that there is a clear line across the EU when it comes to a certain political family that connects what the candidates say in Finland and what they say in Cyprus. Right? It's very much needed if we want to create truly European parties. As also has been said, we need to Europeanize our debates too. We need to have clear European themes when we debate during the European elections. I know how difficult it is to be at the doorstep, asking for people's votes. Obviously, their concerns are going to be much more local than what is at stake there. They might be talking about the pothole in their local road, or perhaps the services they receive from the local authority, rather than considering European issues. But I think it's important that we underline the role that the European Parliament has in improving their lives in simple and concrete terms, but also in grander themes. The more we do that, the better their understanding will be of the value of the European Union. And I know that the responsibility might fall heavy on the shoulders of members of the European Parliament who are out there and engaging citizens, but that's something that also we in civil society can help with. We are on the ground, we are trusted messengers, we engage citizens day in and day out, and we are keen to work with the European Parliament as a whole, but also members of the European Parliament individually, to make sure that we explain what exactly is it that the European Parliament does for them and how important it is that they have their voice here. And one last thing connects with something I said earlier, is to make sure that the presence of European political parties is well routed in national debates in the media. So when there's coverage of European elections at the local or national level, we shouldn't just be talking at the national parties, we should be talking at the European parties, and we should be talking at the leadership of the European parties. It might be, that person might be from another country speaking another language, but again, the media have a huge role to play into bringing the message from the European level down to the local level. So there is a lot we can do to work with the press at the local and regional level as much as the national level, in the absence of the European press, to ensure that those European voices are heard down at the local level. I think I have exhausted my available time. I look forward to the Q&A session, and of course working with all of you going forward in the weeks, months and years ahead until we're able to achieve a true electoral reform at the European level. Thank you very much again for this initiative and the invitation.
Thank you very much, Petros. Before we move on to the Q&A, I have a list of MEPs that have requested the floor. Please, we have to be very strict with the time because we have to finish 5 minutes before 3. So 2 minutes Max, please make your point or your question in 2 minutes. I know you can, because this is the time we have in a plenary debate, so you're trained for that. Maybe just a couple of thoughts on some things that have been said. Leinen mentioned that we have to aim for, if we go for a pan-European constituency, for more than 25, which was the last proposal, and I agree. With the current treaty, we can go up to 46, and I think it will be good, because this allows for more members per transnational list elected, and that means more MEPs from from a variety of member states, including medium and small sized. To that, I will add that we need, I think, to imagine a list divided in batches of 5, for example, or 4, and we have to ensure that in each batch of 5 we have geographical balance. This means what we can not do, because it will obviously be not acceptable, I think, and for good reason, is that we have a transnational list in which the number 1 is coming from Spain, the number 2 is coming from Italy, the number 3 is coming from France, and the number 4 is coming from Germany. That will not be acceptable, and I think this is what we have to design well. We have to ensure that within each batch of 4 or 5, we have geographical balance. Now, on the question of postal voting, that it's not connected strictly to the question of the pan-European constituency, but was raised by Professor Michael Kedin, I think it's very important. It's very important because with postal voting, we can reach people that otherwise wouldn't participate in the elections, and not only those that are displaced or are living in another member state or in a third country, but also, and this is very important, and this is also a aim of the report, we can reach better citizens with disabilities. It is well established that postal voting it's very good, it's very much appropriate for people with disabilities. So and by the way, you know probably in your member states the difficulties of the national postal services. So I think that if we give them a constitutional role in ensuring participation in European elections, we will be doing also a very good thing, also from the perspective of, from a social democratic perspective, in terms of public sector jobs. So I give the floor first of all to, in my list, Gabi Bischoff, a good friend, as all of you, and member of the AFCO, vice chair of the AFCO committee, and member also of the Federalist movement, and someone that has been very vocal for a very long time supporting transnational lists. So Gabi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dominic, and thank you to all the speakers. It was also good to see you, because we can see that we as the progressive group have a long tradition fighting for more democracy here in Europe. So we are all here in a historic line. And I think it's very good, because what we saw in the variety of speakers is we are not discussing anymore, are you in favor of transnational lists or against it, or in favor of Spitzenkandidaten. We saw what happened 2019, and we are working hard. And here I appreciate the work very much to change this. So my question would be, if we look at pragmatic solutions and the right package, we got some ideas today. On one hand, on transnational lists and Spitzenkandidaten, what parameters would ensure the highest degree of visibility and democratic accountability would be a question to the experts. And another one, I listened also very carefully to this point of Professor Keding on equal opportunity and capacity, especially referring to elections. Do you have any research you can refer to also to other consultation processes? Because we just started yesterday this platform on the future of Europe, and here to see, I think I would rather presume also that if people don't take part in elections, that even fewer of them then would participate in such initiatives, and what can be done to address this specifically, because I think it's a risk if more and more people feel sort of disconnected from these processes. Thank you. And with this, I tried to stay with the 2 minutes. Also, I would have a lot more questions, especially how we get to real European parties.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gavi, also for sticking to the time. On your last point, my own take on that is one of the things, of course, it's not the only thing, is precisely the transnational list, because we will be giving a very important power, I believe, to European political families in designing and tabling that list with people from all member states, because a point that I did not mention before, if we go for a constituency of 46, that means that candidates coming from all 27 member states are to be represented. And this is a tremendous amount of political work too, to recruit these candidates, to make political campaign in favor of them. So European political parties will be able to campaign, which this is not the case at the moment. Now, next in my list is also a very good friend and qualified member in many important topics in our group, financially in particular, Margarida Marquez.
Merci Domenech, merci d'avoir organisé ce débat. Je dois dire, je ne suis pas membre d'EFCO.
Thank you, Dominique. I'm not a member of AFCO, but I've been interested in this discussion for many years, which is why I'm here today. I wanted to thank you and congratulate you on the report. And to make best use of the 2 minutes, I would like to point out that the reason for having this discussion is that we want to improve democracy in Europe and citizens' participation. I think we should always bear those 2 aims in mind, because if you get bogged down in so-called technical issues, I think it's very important to remember the perspective that I've described. And a European public space is very important to create here, as in other areas. So the Conference on the Future of Europe can help with both of the aims I mentioned, deepening democracy and creating a European public space. As for European political parties, I think we have made some progress here. European political parties do exist. The problem is that European political parties don't present lists, and national members of European political parties do not immediately accept the... Interpreters apologize, the sound is not good enough.
Il faut différents steps. On ne peut pas l'avoir d'un jour au lendemain. Il faut un calendrier, il faut des progrès pour arriver à des listes transnationaux. Concernant le programme politique européen, effectivement, lors des dernières élections, on a eu des manifestos du Parti socialiste européen. Et nous, dans les États membres, pendant les campagnes électorales, on a utilisé, on a présenté, on s'est basé sur ce manifeste, un manifeste politique européen de notre famille politique. Quelqu'un a dit peut-être qu'on n'a pas vraiment des thèmes européens. Oui, on ne décide pas sur les thèmes européens, mais finalement, par exemple, quand on regarde les campagnes électorales dans les différents pays, on voit que le climat a été un thème qui a été présent dans toutes les campagnes dans les 27 États membres de l'Union européenne. Et je passe aux listes transnationales. Les listes transnationales doivent assurer que la démocratie fonctionne. Et je pense que c'était Leinen qui a soulevé la question. Bien évidemment, il y a des grandes questions politiques derrière et vous avez donné des contributions intéressantes, mais il faut aussi regarder les questions techniques pour assurer qu'il y a un équilibre régional et une participation démocratique, l'équilibre homme-femme, etc. Finalement, le Spitzenkandidat. Donc ici aussi, on a fait des progrès depuis le commencement, depuis le début de ce débat. Avec le traité de Lisbonne, le texte est plus clair qu'il n'était pas avant concernant le Spitzenkandidat, mais je pense que nous, les Européens, les institutions européennes, ont donné une mauvaise réponse, ont traité cette problématique très mal lors de la nomination des présidents des différentes institutions. C'est-à-dire, la situation de 2019 va nous réduire la marge de manœuvre et la crédibilité pour l'idée du Spitzenkandidat. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Margarida. Tu as mentionné que tu n'as participé.
Thank you, Margarida. You did say that you're not in AFCO, but in fact, the very reason for having this seminar as a group seminar was for colleagues from AFCO to be able to speak, such as Gabi, but also to have participation by the whole group. Sirius Engerer is here with us in the room. You have the floor.
Dominic, I too am not a member of the AFCO committee, but thank you very much for this opportunity. I am very much interested in this topic since even for 5 years I represented the other side. So I was in the council representing the Maltese government and taking care of this particular file even during the Maltese presidency of the council. So I was the negotiator on the other end during the other legislature though. So it's a different context altogether at the moment. There seems to be a problem with sound. So I wanted to speak. So it seems that I can speak. The most important thing I think that we'll try over here. So I think we must focus on the issue of democratic deficit. So that is where we need to focus. The worst thing that could happen is what happened in 2019, which gave citizens the impression that the European elections would, at the end of the day, elect indirectly a European Commission president, when then we had some political parties that played a different game, which resulted, as Margarita said, in the loss of credibility of this whole process that all institutions, but particularly the European Parliament, were working on for such a long time to have and give more democratic strength to the electoral process of the European Parliament elections that has been going on since 1979, slowly increasing in strength, but unfortunately still lacking when it comes to the actual election of the person that, at the end of the day, citizens in all member states of the European Union see as the figure that, at the end of the day, heads this European Union of ours, although in reality that person leads or presides over only one of the institutions. But back in our member states, citizens see the President of the Commission as that person that, at the end of the day, is leading this union of ours. Keeping in mind European citizens, I believe that we must work not to further alienate them. Having a loss of credibility, as what happened in 2019, risks alienating people, and we must ensure that people turn out to vote. We have seen this interesting presentation today from this professor who explained to us the different social realities which leads to different turnouts. But I come from a country in which there is a very high interest in elections, and we have the highest turnout in European Parliament elections, and I do not want to have a situation where in my country turnout ends up going down rather than going up because of a new electoral law here in the European Parliament. So we need to make sure that this debate that we're having will lead to an increase in all other member states, an increase in my member state as well, because it would be good to have even more people voting, but at the end of the day not lead towards reducing the number of people that go out and actually vote. And this brings me to the topic of transnational lists. I myself find it intriguing, and I'm very much in favor of having a transnational list. However, we need to make sure that, I mean, the devil is in the detail at the end of the day, and we need to make sure, as you said, Dominic, plenty of times today, and as Irache mentioned, she mentioned the geographical balance. You mentioned the small and medium-sized member states. I would go a step further and say that we must make sure and make it a must that all member states would be represented not only in the lists in a fair way, but also in the elected deputies that would, at the end of the day, be elected to the European Parliament. So it's a very difficult task to find a way to make this work. But at the end of the day, if small countries like mine and medium-sized countries like some slightly bigger countries than mine feel that they would, at the end of the day, be totally left out from the system, then it will obviously not work, because there won't be the council that would give its green light to such a proposal. Finally, I enjoyed a lot listening to Joe Leinen's intervention. I had met him a number of times when we were leading the presidency of the council, as well as other members who were the shadow rapporteurs and rapporteurs from other political parties on this particular file. I was fascinated with his idea of having citizens being able to become directly members of the European political parties. I think that such an idea would be great to increase the engagement of citizens at a European level, and I think that we could seize the moment of the pandemic, which somehow sort of has a silver lining, in the sense that for people it has now become a new normal to do things virtually, electronically, as we are having this webinar today. And it might be a great opportunity to seize and make a reality, even for our party, the Party of European Socialists, and us here, S&D, in the European Parliament, to go and engage with citizens in this new normal that they have now become accustomed to. I think this current reality can give us an opportunity to get citizens on board and be present with us here in Brussels, in Strasbourg, or wherever we are, to do politics together. Thank you.
Thank you, Cyrus. Well, thank you very much for your points. I think maybe the conditions you propose, one goes one step too far, because of course election not only depends on how you build the list, but also on the number of votes you get, on electoral performance. So there will be more members elected in one list than another. So we cannot ensure that in every list, you know, someone from a member state will be elected. But what we can, I think, ensure by design is that a candidate will have, from a given member state, will have the same chance as another, particularly the big ones, of being in the list. And by the same token, some candidates, or better said, everyone will have also the same chance of not being elected. Because if we have geographical balance between each batch of 5, that means that there will be big states that will not be represented in the first or second batch. They will be represented in the third, to make the point clear, between member number 10 and candidate number 10 and candidate 15 of the list. So you will not have necessarily someone from a big member state elected if that party is going to get 10 seats. So you will have what we have to ensure is an equal probability of being elected or of not being elected, I will say. But it's a bit complicated to explain without a chart, but we will do that also. But thank you for your points. Also interesting point on the membership, direct membership of European political parties. Now, Mia Petra Kumpula-Natri, also member of AFCO, member from Finland. ¿Tienes prisa? Okay, Mia Petra, go ahead.
Sorry, Dominic, I had to jump in the car, but I hope you can hear me. I'm traveling to Brussels and hope I can make a short remark here. Thanks first of all for organizing it, and then few comments on the topics here. One outside, it is from Nordic countries, and I talk to the colleagues because there are not many in AFCO, that own commissioner is the link for the preparing and powers of the commission, and we find it that is very groundbreaking and important that we still remain with this connection to the member states and the countries, that they should then know, even they not present it, but then on the preparation they know the countries. On the Spitzenkandidaten, very short note that yes, the system has to be clear and so that the citizens can trust after the episode of the 2019 elections, and that is important, and we have to agree in between the parties and the law so that it can be trusted after. For the transnational list, the Nordic countries have been very reluctant to the idea, and maybe the fear is losing the representation for the countries to the big ones or the big language groups then who can more easily talk to each other, as we have many small language groups, not only countries. And I thank Secretary General Fassulas for taking up these concerns very closely, because I also think that on the local level, the idea to work close to citizens, it is also the work on the climate, on the global issues close to citizens. And I think NGOs can show us a little bit of way that they can more easily nowadays to challenge some problems together and then work together despite where the person comes from, because they have a clear issue. When you fight for the climate, you don't necessarily look at this is the Finnish member of the WWF or other, but they do have action groups and they can spread the message. So once we have the clear message, we have more ground for the European parties to be more visible, as elaborated the role of the media here. So, but I think one reason also to be reluctant for transnational lists is that you have this sense of distance, but then also the sense of the hierarchy growing. And that is what we don't want to lose, is that the hierarchical system in the parties and among the citizens and the president or members of the parliament or members of the European Parliament, it's very low in many Nordic countries and the countries that I know best. And it's also idea that you have some far transnational list and then you create these figures, but not that easily to access. So then the kind of accessibility to talk and lower the hierarchy so that you are not the empire and then you are the citizens. But then you have very close cooperation and parties have here the main job to do. But then Dominic, thank you so much for elaborating this geographical representation. It is also our group line that when it comes to introducing transnational lists, that must be rules to ensure balance between small and large member states, and that is very important. I personally see the good note that last time we had the voter turnout increased, and then also if we can find ways that the transnational list could be something to add on and not to take away, could be a way to work forward. But I cannot guarantee that many others will have the same appetite, but very good work and interesting to continue the discussions. Thanks you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mia Petra, and indeed, and as Cyrus said before, and Irache, our proposal is it's focusing very much on the question of geographical balance and gender balance, of course. So we are going to work in the two dimensions, and I hope it will be convincing. Espera, queda Pedro Silva. So now I give the floor to Pedro Silva, Vice President of the European Parliament, also member of AFCO, and someone that has been working also for a long time on these constitutional matters of Transnational List and Spitzenkandidaten. Pedro, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, thank you, Dominic, for organizing this discussion. Also, thank you to the guest speakers. Now, well, we have two items, Transnational List and Spitzenkandidaten. Well, for the Transnational List, I will wait for concrete proposals on these arrangements for geographical balance. I would just say at this stage that I wouldn't very much count with 46 available seats, because we also have to consider enlargement. So 46 seems to me a figure that does not correspond to the expectations of reserving seats also for enlargement. Now, on the Spitzenkandidaten, well, my position is quite clear. I think, yes, we should improve and consolidate the Spitzenkandidaten process, but from my point of view, understood as a qualified speaker for each European family, organizing the European political debate and making it more visible for citizens. What I'm not in agree with is with this link between transnational lists and the Spitzenkandidaten process. Because we only have two ways of understanding this. Either we understand the transnational lists with Spitzenkandidaten in front of them as a direct election of the President of the European Commission. And then we are introducing a presidential element, presidentialist element in our parliamentary system. We have a presidential election inside the parliamentary elections. We would undermine the role of the European Parliament in selecting the president in terms of accountability towards the new commission. And we, as we wouldn't have a second round for this election, we would facilitate the election of a candidate with less than 30% and perhaps an Eurosceptic one. But there's an alternative. The alternative is seems to be the line of our group in our document on the constitutional future of Europe, which is to have a mixed legitimacy. So, in one hand, we have candidates to the position of President of the Commission that would have to present themselves in the transnational lists. And then the candidates will have to get a majority in the parliament, so they can be finally elected. So it is confusing, these two elements. In one side, the direct legitimacy, in the other hand, the building of majorities in the parliament, because the building of a political majority cannot be mandatory. We cannot say to political groups that they have to agree necessarily in one of the candidates that were presented. Because take the 2019 elections, what would that mean? It would mean that we would have as President of the European Commission either Weber or Timmermans. Now, we were not willing to vote for Weber, and the EPP, very understandably, were not willing to vote for Timmermans. So how can we solve this situation? Sometimes political majorities have to be built with third solutions, and I think we have to allow for some room of maneuver for that, even if we don't like the idea. So, Spitzenkandidaten, yes, but I believe that they should be qualified speakers for each political family and not necessarily the result of direct vote, because that would be misleading about our political system and the way we build compromises in Europe. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pedro. As I said before, my understanding is that we are not running a presidential election in any event because you could win. You could be the head of a transnational list, and that list could be the most voted, but still you are going to need to build a majority in the European Parliament after the election in any event. So now the floor to Juan Fernando Lopez Aguilar, former Minister of Justice in Spain, Chair of the Libe Committee, and full Chair of Constitutional Law. So Juan Fernando, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Domenic, for giving me the floor. I have been a member of this European Parliament for more than 10 years now, and it's quite a fact that I have been mostly devoted to the area of liberties, justice, and security, which means the scope of competences of the Libe Committee, which I've chaired. That's due mainly to my political background as former Minister of Justice. But as a professor of constitutional law, I have passionately followed every step being made throughout all of these years by the AFCO committee, of which I happen to be a substitute member for a couple of terms now. And the point I would like to make is that I am fully convinced that there is no such thing as democratic deficit in this European Parliament. By no means. Directly elected, no democratic deficit of legitimacy. Law-making body, no democratic deficit of competence. By no means. It's got, yes, let's face it, a visibility deficit, audibility deficit. We have a trouble when it comes to being seen enough or heard of enough from the European citizens and by the European citizens. We have a problem of visibility and audibility, and there is much to be done in order to reach out to the citizens we represent directly as the unique, only democratically legitimized body of the European architecture, actually as the legitimizing motor of the whole European decision-making process. And that is why we have made it such a point to explain how could we do better when it comes to getting more parliamentarian the decision-making process in the political meaning of that word, which means how to do better when submitting the Commission to scrutiny. We invest the Commission, that's for sure. We examine thoroughly each and every one individuals of the Commission portfolios. Actually, in that regard, we actually make a difference when we compare ourselves to national parliaments. There is no national parliament who's got the power to confirm or reject a member of the College of the Government, Cabinet, Council of Ministers, whatever the name. There is no national parliament with the power we have to invest, confirm, or reject an individual member of the European Commission. But the point I'm making is that in order to go more parliamentarian, we have to take seriously the political message that was encapsulated in the Spitzenkandidaten principle. So let's face it, it was a great disappointment that after all the bother, all the effort, all the energy we put into it, so that we made it visible for the European citizens that each and every European scale political group in this House presented a candidate for the position of President of the Commission, namely the PP, it was Manfred Weber last time, S&D, it was Franz Timmermans, Renew, it was this one's Guy Verhofstadt, I can recall. It was GUE, Greens, Seska Keller. And the point I'm making is that we have to somehow overcome the difficulty and the challenge that it poses, the fact that this principle was dismissed by the Council in a decisive juncture when they rejected the landscape of candidates, the menu of candidates they had at disposal, and made the bid for the former defense minister of the German federal government, which is now the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. So we have to come up with somehow a renewal, particularly as members of the S&D family, with a renewal, new impetus, new momentum for the Spitzenkandidaten principle. And in that regard, to make the bridge with the transnational lists, it's a battle worth fighting. Yes, I know where the difficulties lie. Actually, we have experienced disappointments and failures in this battle of us, but we have to be distinctive and persevere in linking this principle. Transnational lists would somehow bring about new momentum for the idea of the Spitzenkandidat, because otherwise we will add up to the visibility problem of the European Parliament a credibility problem, a major credibility challenge. In due time, it will happen in 2024. I conclude by putting a question to you all, a direct question, an outright question to you all. How are we to face the European public, the European citizens, in upcoming elections 2024 as to the Spitzenkandidat issue when we failed to sustain the principle in 2019 after the endorsement of the interinstitutional agreement that was made in 2018 and the resolutions of the European Parliament ever since 2012 endorsing this Spitzenkandidaten principle. So I think we have a challenge, but we also have an opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juan Fernando. And very quickly, we have to finish at 3, but we are almost there. I give the speakers, unfortunately, 1 minute per speaker, so focus in one message that you want to deliver. We start with Leinen.
You and Fernando, indeed, we have a lot of elements of democracy, but what is lacking is clearly the European political sphere, the European polity. And according to Habermas, democracy is that you can deliberate on the level where you take decisions. And we cannot deliberate on the European level enough for the decisions we do for our common goods. Then, Pedro, you repeat that again and again. The Spitzenkandidaten on European lists is a clearly parliamentary system. There is nothing presidential. And then third, I think as well that we have to strengthen European political parties as well, our PSE. It's not well functioning, and that can be done by things we do ourselves, but maybe as well having more resources available. It's very tiny. European parties don't get donations like on a national level in many countries. So I think they should get more money to do their job.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dominic, and thank you and congratulations that you go on the electoral law and put the new elements on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, lieber Joe, and also for keeping with the time. Michael, one minute for final thought.
Thank you very much. Potentially, ladies and gentlemen, honorable members, European elections have a legitimizing power. Potentially. But that depends on the level of participation in the elections. And allow me to be very blunt and remind everyone that even in the 2019 elections, it was in 9 member states where the voter turnout went down. It was 16 member states in the European elections 2019 where the turnout rate was below 50%. It was 8 member states where the turnover was below 35%. So if we want to make the European elections a legitimizing event and to give European elections legitimizing power, we have to pay more attention, in my opinion, and I offered you some of the data we are preparing for participating in elections depending heavily on socio-economic factors. Because if we do not pay attention to the social element, that social equality links very closely with political equality, we lose the integrative and the legitimizing function of elections. And I'm happy to continue this discussion also beyond this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Sean. And Petros, also 1 minute for you. And then Marek Belka, our Vice President, will deliver the concluding remarks.
Thank you very much indeed. I just want to echo what has already been said, both by Joe and Professor Keating. I think the points they raised.
Unfortunately, the interpreters point out the sound is not good enough to permit interpretation.
The other speakers from the European Parliament, the members of the European Parliament offer. My concluding thoughts are that the European elections are very, very important because they are the only transnational democratic exercise in the world. They might be imperfect, and I'm glad to see everybody working on this, but we need to remind ourselves that this is one of the greatest experiments in transnational democracy. So I look forward to working with the European Parliament, with civil society, to make sure that between now and the next European elections, we are able to do even better and engage even more citizens in this glorious democratic exercise. Thank you.
Thank you, Petros, also to all the colleagues that have intervened, those also in the room, Cyrus and Juan Fernando. Just one reminder, the party of the European Socialists has endorsed twice the proposal for a transnational constituency. Thank you. And also in our own political position as a group in the paper that Pedro mentioned, the paper on the constitutional future of the EU. Marek Belka, our Vice President in charge in the group of Constitutional Affairs, please, you have the floor for the concluding remarks. Thank you for being with us and for your support.
Thank you, Dominic. Thank you, all the participants and the panelists. I have not been in the Parliament before. I haven't participated in the discussions on the electoral code. Well, also, I haven't lived through the disappointment that we all lived through in the last electoral or at the outcome of the last electoral cycle. But what we are discussing, as a matter of fact, is to invoke more interest in the people, in the citizens about the European Union, more understanding about how the Europe affects their lives, and in result, to have Europe strengthened. For this, we need programs, of course, but we also need leaders. We need faces. We need people that citizens can associate themselves with. And the whole process that we are discussing is about choosing, creating leaders. This is how I understand this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ya terminó. Thank you very much, Marek. So thank you to all the participants and also those that have followed through the website. I think we had provided a lot of thinking, a lot of ideas, and we are going to proceed our work in the AFCO committee with all these inputs, and we also hope to continue the discussion within the group in order to have an all-encompassing political position. Thank you very much.